I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined by Dr. Dean Radin, Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and Distinguished Professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Dr. Radin has given over 500 talks and interviews worldwide and is the author or co-author of hundreds of scientific and popular articles, 4 book chapters, 2 technical books, and 4 popular books translated into 15 foreign languages. He's also served on dissertation committees at Saybrook Graduate School and Research Center and is the former president of the Parapsychological Association, along with being the co-editor-in-chief of the journal Explore, the Journal of Science and Healing. Well, Dean, thank you and welcome. And let me start out by asking about your background. You're a parapsychologist, but your undergrad work was originally in electrical engineering, and later you had a PhD in educational psychology. Can you tell me what inspired you to change from a traditional engineering path to a focus on what would become parapsychology?
Sure. So as far as my background goes, the reason why it looks like switching from initially actually music, violin performance, and then engineering, and then psychology, and now parapsychology, is because I've always been interested in everything. I want to know everything, but I haven't figured out how to be in 20 places at once. So I've had to pursue my interests in sequence. So besides the formal education, I also have quite a bit of time spent in doing psychophysiology and optical physics. And now I'm learning about genetic engineering and also the philosophy of science.
Okay.
I would like to, at some point, if I ever retire, I'd like to go back to school to learn about geography and geology and astronomy and organic chemistry and a whole bunch of other things. And then when I retire from that, I want to go back to playing in bluegrass bands.
Okay. So there's actually a lot of cross-pollination then, probably, between the different disciplines you've studied.
Well, I would say that my career is more of a multidisciplinary generalist rather than an expert who has spent all of one's career in one area. And so the advantage of that is that I get a very broad brush view of what science is and what it can do and all of that. The disadvantage is that it means that I can talk to scientists in many disciplines, but I don't have the same level of depth that many do in their own discipline. This is probably not the case in parapsychology because that's the domain where I've actually spent the most time. But even in parapsychology, I find that it's very useful to have a multidisciplinary approach to understanding what's going on.
Oh, okay. Well, in terms of that career history, right, I would say that seems like it parallels your educational history and definitely follows the interests as well. I mean, you've worked for incredibly prestigious organizations, including Bell Labs, Princeton, GTE Labs, the University of Edinburgh, SRI International, many others, as well as teaching as a professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So you'd mentioned that most of your career has been in parapsychology, but have you found, I guess, a fair amount of benefit from having the other career experience to leverage into that?
I actually never taught. I never wanted to teach. In graduate school, I did teach a couple of classes, but mainly because I had a teaching assistantship for a couple of years. But everything else I've done has always been involved in research. And as I said, it's because of a predilection where I never wanted to be in management and I never wanted to be in charge of other people, as teachers are. I have enough trouble keeping in charge of myself. So I have great admiration for people who are educators because we obviously need that sort of thing, but that wasn't one of my interests.
Okay. So that you're talking mostly about like the University of Nevada then. That was more of a research position.
It was. I was director of laboratory. And even at Princeton, I was director of a research program. I happened to have an appointment in the Department of Psychology, but I wasn't a professor, at least not a teaching professor. And all of the industrial places that I've worked, initially at Bell Labs and GTE Labs, mostly involved advanced telecommunications research. And both of those places, so there was enough time to do to look into things on your own, roughly 20% of the time, primarily because while some of the research I did was my own, most of the time I was involved in groups. And so if you're working with a group of 15 to 25 people, you have to work in lockstep with them. And so if I happened to finish my stuff early, I had to wait for them to catch up, and then I had free time. So during that free time, I actually started doing parapsychological studies when I was at Bell Labs. But in general, most of the industrial research has been mostly industrial. All of the academic research has been parapsychology.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Well, now, currently in your career, you're with the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is the nonprofit that funds the Global Consciousness Project. And I know you have a lot of side projects as well. But so can you tell me a little bit about this organization and well, I guess how you came to be with Noetic Sciences, and then how the Global Consciousness Project came about from that?
So the Institute of Noetic Sciences was started in 1973 by the Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell. He was the sixth man on the moon. And on the way back from the moon to the Earth, when Edgar was looking out of the window, as he says, he had the window seat because his job was over. His job was to land on the moon. So they already did that. And in looking out of the window, he had a full-blown mystical experience. The way he described it was a palpable feeling of unity with the universe. So as you can imagine, that's a little bit unexpected for an MIT-trained scientist and aircraft pilot and all that, and astronaut, all of which is completely dependent on science and technology. And yet he had this classic experience that had been described throughout history, which is a mystical experience. So not surprisingly, he became curious about what is that experience? How do we understand that from a scientific perspective? So our institute was founded by him to do the equivalent of studying the outer limits of inner space, because he was an explorer of the outer limits of outer space and discovered in the process, and by the way, as many other astronauts have, that there's also just as mysterious inner space, the frontiers of the inner. So we use the tools of science and technology to understand these, at least within the scientific perspective, to understand unusual or unexplained experiences that have something to do with consciousness. So I learned about ions, as we call it. I learned about ions in the early 80s because and what attracted me to at the time was that the motto of the Institute was exploring the frontiers of consciousness. So I always liked the idea of exploring the frontiers of human consciousness. That sounds like fun. It's the outer limits of inner space. Who couldn't like that? So I kept track of and was a member of IONS for many years. And then it was 2001, I had an opportunity to go to a new job. And at just that time, there was an opening made at IONS to build an in-house laboratory. And so I was asked if I wanted to do that, and timing was perfect, and I said yes, and I've been there ever since.
Oh, that's awesome. So it just kind of came together then. Well, so the Global Consciousness Project, I mean, I first learned about this when you started appearing on Art Bell years ago. Mm-hmm. But, and I think most people probably learned about your work then. And so at the time, I think you guys were doing online card prediction experiments. And then I remember you talking numerous times about the Princeton egg experiment. I was wondering if you could describe these a little for me, because I think I might be wrong, but I think these are probably the two that most people are the most familiar with.
Yeah, there's a bit of confusion there. The Global Consciousness Project started at Princeton by a psychologist there named Roger Nelson, who's still working on that project, although we're now changing it over into what we're calling GCP 2.0, because the Global Consciousness Project started around 1997. It was online by 1998, and it continued until 500 events were registered. So the GCP involved, it still involves because it's still running. But the idea is that there have been many, many experiments using random number generators in the laboratory, typically with one person who tries to mentally influence the generator. And it has become a classic way of studying mind-matter interactions in the laboratory. And the way that you see a result is that you ask a person to effectively try to influence the output of a binary generator so that it produces more ones than zeros, say. So what Roger decided to do after a while was those experiments involve intention. Sometimes direct intention, where you see some kind of a curve on the screen, or you're trying to influence mentally what it's doing, and sometimes more indirectly, like you might see a photograph on the screen and wish the photograph to morph into a different photograph. There are many, many different ways of providing feedback in these experiments, but they're all based on intention. So Roger got the idea, what would happen if we went to something where there was a huge amount of coherent attention in a group? And so he went to things like choruses and plays and movies and meditations to see if the act of a bunch of people simply paying attention to the same thing at the same time would also create a change in the random numbers. And the answer is yes. So what we see in those kinds of experiments, which were called field consciousness experiments, is that the randomness being produced by a random number generator begins to deviate away from chance and more towards a patterned output.
Okay.
So
now,
I'm progressing towards the development of the GCP because we're not there yet.
I'm sorry.
So this is about the mid-90s. And then a bunch of us sort of hopped on board and started doing our own field consciousness experiments. And we pretty quickly were able to confirm that what Roger was seeing we saw it too. So a bunch of us were together at a meeting, I think in late 97, and we were discussing how do we test this on a much larger scale. And the reason we thought of that is because shortly before that meeting, Princess Diana in the UK had died in an accident. And so we knew that her funeral was coming up, and we managed to get about a dozen colleagues around the world to run their own random number generators to see what was going to happen during the funeral. Because we knew the funeral would be broadcast live and a lot of people would be listening in. So we have the opportunity of having maybe 100 million people all paying attention to the same thing at the same time, which it's no longer quite as unusual as it used to be, but at the time it was very unusual to have millions upon millions of people in lockstep at the same time attending around the world. So we all ran our random number generators. We found that collectively there was a statistically significant deviation from chance. So we thought, okay, let's make a version of this that will run 24/7 without any human intervention and put random generators in major cities around the world. So we cover the world. So I said, oh, that's like an electrodiagram. Gaia is, of course, the planet. It's a takeoff on the idea of an electroencephalogram where you put a bunch of electrodes around the brain, around the head. So we're putting a bunch of electrodes, in this case, random generators, around the world. So we created an electrodiagram, which the acronym is EGG. So the Princeton EGG project is the Global Consciousness Project. The word EGG was just a funny name I came up with.
Oh, for the electrodiagram.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. Well, I should apologize for being confused.
Yeah, it can be confusing. So anyway, so that experiment ran for 500 formal events. A formal event was something either that was coming up, that was planned, like a big meditation or a funeral of a famous person, or spontaneous events like terrorist attacks. And the formal part of this was that since the data is being recorded all the time, we have 20 years of continual data on this. But the events typically were a day or less, sometimes a little longer than a day. And so we had to define, before we looked at the data, what we considered to be an event. Sometimes it was an hour long, sometimes 8 hours, sometimes a day, but we defined that first, and then we looked at the data. So that prevents us from trying to shoehorn the data to fit world events. It's all set up in advance. So the experiment ended after 500 major events like this, and it ended up with over a 7 sigma result. So the odds against chance of 7 sigma is about 3 trillion to 1 odds against chance. So it's very clear that something was happening. And the beauty of this experiment is that the way that Roger set it up from the beginning is that it's all in the public domain. It's as transparent as you can get as an experiment, because all of the data was not only present at the time, it's still present. Somebody who was really motivated could download all of the data, redo the entire analysis, and they're going to end up with the same result that we saw.
Well, and that was something I wondered about. It just kind of intrigued me as an idea, was being able to take something like 20 years of historical data, right, and reprocess that. Now, I don't know exactly what that would entail, but, faster computers, newer algorithms, or just, lessons learned, I guess, right? And I wondered, is that something that anyone's ever looked at doing? And do you think anything new might come out of that?
Well, in fact, a physicist in France named Peter Bancel did exactly this. He got intrigued by the idea of the project. He independently downloaded all of the data, independently did the analysis, and confirmed that the 7 sigma result is indeed 7 sigma. What he has gone through several different variations on how to interpret the data. We know that it's not due to chance. We know that it's not due to statistical mistakes. But the question is, once you recognize that it's a real effect, that the data really are being changed in some way, is that due to global consciousness? Is it due to simply millions or billions of people thinking the same things at the same time, or simply paying attention? Or is it something that has to do with the way that the experiment was actually run? So at first glance, it seems like, there's some kind of a patterning force or negentropic effect that is created by simply the coherent minds. Coherent minds create a coherent world somehow. That was the original idea. But what Peter Bancel was suggesting is that maybe of the 500 events that were selected, that maybe it was something about the selection of the event that was important. And so this is part of an ongoing discussion within the field of how do we interpret an experiment that looks like it was like a mind-matter interaction causal event, as opposed to simply selecting the right time to begin an experiment. So this is still a psychic event, because there's nothing that can give you a clue as to when to begin an experiment. But nevertheless, that is it's a different way of thinking about what's happening in these experiments, and it's important to figure it out, because in one hand you're suggesting that there's a causal force associated with consciousness, and on the other hand, it's more like an intuitive ability that people have to do the right thing at the right time. So those are two very different kinds of explanations, and at this point, it's not entirely clear which one of those is best.
Well, and it's interesting that you should mention that, because I was just going to ask about synchronicity. And so I've been doing some reading on this, and it brought me back to Carl Jung, who suggested that basically these highly improbable but meaningful coincidences could be connected to a global consciousness. And I didn't find a lot more details than that, at least not that I understood. But do you think that might play a role in this somehow?
Well, synchronicities are meaningful events, but the meaning is almost always associated with an individual's interpretation, right? So one person's synchronicity, you can tell it to somebody else and they'll say, well, that's just a coincidence. And so you take a statistical perspective, you can say somebody is going to win the $500 million lottery. They're just going to win it. And eventually somebody's going to win the lottery. From that person, the person who wins could say, oh, it's because I used my lucky coin, or I bought it with my lucky dollar, or something like that. They'll find meaning, typically, to say, why did this happen to me? So the anecdote, the personal anecdote, is usually very compelling, but it's not used as scientific evidence.
Okay.
So what you can, from that perspective, then you can say that virtually every experiment looking at various kinds of psychic ability are attempts to create a synchronicity in the laboratory. That's what these experiments are all about. So it's no longer spontaneous because we're defining it in advance and we're doing something that we're asking people to be psychic on demand, and it works. It works often enough that we can get high confidence that some psychic phenomena are really real. And it's very different than a synchronicity because in this case, we know what the probabilities are in advance. So when we calculate the statistics, it's not like saying, well, we don't really know. It's not like a lottery. We know exactly what the chance outcome would be. And that's like, for example, in the Global Consciousness Project, if you end up with odds against chance of 3 trillion to 1, the reason we can give that number very precisely is because the experiment has been designed as opposed to purely spontaneous.
Okay. So it's subjective versus objective reality. Really, that sounds like that's what you're talking about. Being able to test it and observe it and measure it in a lab, right, makes it objective. So.
It's that, but it's actually more than that, because after all, somebody winning the lottery is a statistical effect, and that's objective. I mean, somebody actually won. The difficulty with the lottery, assigning lottery, is a particular person going to win? In other words, if somebody said, I am going to win the $500,000 or the $500 million lottery next Tuesday at 3:00, then that's a prediction that you can assign an exact probability to. And if the person wins, holy smoke. But if you don't cast it in that term and you just simply say that somebody's going to win it, then it's not quite so interesting.
Okay. Well, so a lot of these things, because, I'm talking more about some of the early experiments. You covered a lot of these things in your first book, right? The Conscious Universe. I remember reading that, but it was quite a while ago. You published it back in 1998. And at the time, the egg experiment and global consciousness was making headlines. So were these really the focus in that book? Or could you describe kind of, again, when you were kind of launching into the book realm, what are some of the things that you really focused on there?
I actually wrote most of The Conscious Universe in 1986 when I was at Princeton. But at the time, nobody wanted to publish it. So years go by, and now 1996, I was featured in a New York Times Magazine article. And the very next day, 4 publishers called and asked if I had ever thought about writing a book. And I said, oh, yes, in fact, I do have an idea for a book. So the next year, The Conscious Universe was published by HarperCollins. So that book, as I originally wrote it, was designed to introduce people to parapsychology in a way that people had not been thinking of at that point. And that was to introduce the idea of meta-analysis, which is the analysis of analyses. That's where the meta comes from. So it's taking lots and lots of experiments looking at the same thing and making an assessment based on the preponderance of the evidence. And so one of the nice things about parapsychology is that because the phenomena are considered so strange, there have been many, many replications by many independent people. And so you can say, well, can we believe the results of a telepathy experiment reported by one laboratory? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe they made a mistake. You really can't tell. But how about if 10 laboratories do the same experiment? Well, unless they're all making exactly the same mistake, it's pretty likely that they're approaching the same topic from slightly different directions, and then the preponderance of the evidence would average out mistakes, and you're left over with the real thing. Well, in the case of something like telepathy experiments, for a certain kind of telepathy experiment has been conducted over 100 times, and there's thousands and thousands of individual sessions, and it's very clear that there is a real effect going on there. That's why we can have very high confidence that telepathy, as seen in the laboratory, is a real thing. So I knew that, my colleagues knew that, but at the time, especially in the 80s, hardly anybody knew this. I mean, you'd still find that mainstream scientists would dismiss something like telepathy because they would say there's no evidence. But this was frustrating because even at that time, there was a lot of evidence. And by the time 10 years later, when I wrote this book, there was much more. So that book was concentrating on how can we say from a scientific perspective, and using all of the tools of science, like independent replication, how do we know that these things are real? So that's what that book really focused on.
Oh, okay. That makes sense then. And so you moved into, I thought this was really interesting. Your second book then, Entangled Minds, you moved more into the realm of quantum mechanics. And that was extrasensory experiences in a quantum reality, where you were also touching on telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis, but more from a quantum perspective, right?
Right. And that's because after publication of The Conscious Universe, the most common question that I got or feedback was, okay, maybe these things are real, but how are they real? How can we understand it? Because it looks like these phenomena violate basic principles of science. And I knew that wasn't true either. These are like memes that take on a life of their own that are simply not true. So I decided to talk about the two aspects of psychic phenomena that are the mysterious parts. One is that in a classical physics sense, one of the main concepts in classical physics is that if you observe an object or a system, that the act of observing is independent of the behavior of the system. In other words, there's no observer effect. That's an important part of classical physics. The other part of classical physics that's important is that things only change if you bump up against them. It's like a billiard ball model of the universe. You can't get something to move or change or do anything unless you impact it in some way. And that's how most people think about reality. That's our everyday reality. That's how things seem to work. Well, quantum mechanics, of course, is very different because both observer independence is no longer true, and local interactions are no longer true either. So we use terms like observer effect and non-locality. Those are the two things about quantum mechanics that are considered weird. The observer dependence says that if you measure a quantum system, it changes. We don't know why that happens, but it does. And non-locality refers to the fact that things that are far distant beyond the space-time can still interact in some way. We don't understand why that is either, except that's what it is. So I simply pointed out in Entangled Minds that isn't it curious that psychic phenomena are considered strange because there are observer-dependent effects, just like we saw in the Global Consciousness Project. People observing things changes something, and that these effects do not seem to occur in space or time. And those are the same two effects that are strange in quantum mechanics. So some would say, well, you're trying to mix two mysteries, and I would say, I don't think so. We're talking about two very peculiar mysteries that are exactly the same. They're both called weird, both in quantum mechanics and in psychic phenomena, and I don't think that's a coincidence.
Well, and it's interesting too. I was just reading about the Penrose and Hameroff again, and so they'd suggested that microtubules in our body may incorporate quantum effects, and then I understand like photosynthesis in plants may incorporate quantum effects. So, I wonder if those mechanisms aren't already there, or do you think maybe that's too simplistic of an explanation for how some of this might connect, I guess?
Well, the way I describe it is that quantum mechanics does not explain consciousness, and nor does it explain psychic phenomena. What it does is point to a kind of physical reality that is compatible with these phenomena. And so this is an important distinction. It's a little bit like I'm pointing at the solution, but you keep staring at my hand. I tell my dog, go over there, and I point, and the dog looks at my finger. No, it's where I'm pointing at that you should look at. And so people mistake the pointing for the thing itself. And that distinction is important because quantum mechanics today describes a world that actually it's not compatible yet with something like telepathy, because While there are non-local effects that occur in quantum mechanics, they're correlations. It's not showing causal effect. It's not signal passing. So something like telepathy looks a lot like more than simply a correlation. Like two people are not simply thinking the same thing spontaneously, but it looks both experimentally and certainly anecdotally like one person starts thinking about another person, and then the second person somehow receives that. Like there's this passing of a signal. Well, quantum mechanics doesn't allow that. On the other hand, quantum mechanics is not the end of physics. There are lots and lots of people at the edge of physics now that are looking at subquantum models or superquantum models. And the moment you get out of the current formulation of quantum mechanics, which is called linear, you go into nonlinear form of quantum mechanics, then you can have transmission of information. So I strongly suspect that quantum mechanics is telling us there will be another form of even more advanced physics that will incorporate classical mechanics and quantum mechanics, but it will also give a bigger picture of the way that reality works, which will be even closer to actual psychic phenomena.
Well, now it's interesting too, because in the second book, it's you're working with such cutting edge physics, and then in your third book, Supernormal, I believe that's your third. Hopefully, I haven't gotten my order wrong. You actually went back to ancient knowledge and focused on supernormal science, yoga, and the evidence for extraordinary abilities. Could you tell me a little bit about what drew you to that direction and what you'd found there?
Well, that book came about because feedback from Entangled Minds was that, so quantum mechanics maybe is pointing in the right direction, but it's still a very mechanistic way of thinking about these things. And this raises the notion of science as a philosophy that most people, including scientists, don't think about very much, but all of mainstream science is based on a set of assumptions. These are the assumptions that changed the world, actually, back in the Enlightenment in Europe in the 16th century or so, where the notion of empirically testing reality by doing experiments became the way to go ahead, and using analytical methods and so on. That eventually gave rise to a worldview, which is sometimes called materialism, sometimes called physicalism, and it makes the assumption that everything that happens has to have a base of either matter or energy, which on the surface seems to make sense. It's been a very successful way of doing science. It accounts for many, many things that we see in the physical world, except one thing. And the one thing that it completely fails on is the nature of consciousness itself. I'm talking here about both the concept of awareness and also self-awareness and subjectivity in general. Some people would say that, no, we know that the brain gives rise to consciousness, and that's what gives us a sense of self and so on, except that that's not really the case. That the brain activity is correlated with some aspects of self-awareness and cognition and so on, but it actually does not explain why we are aware of anything. And this has been a long-standing debate in philosophy, but only recently has it come into the scientific domain as neuroscience has advanced. And in thinking about this, and also thinking then about, can materialism actually explain psychic phenomena, since it is related to the mysteries of consciousness in some way? And I thought, well, it's very difficult. It's one of the reasons there's so much scientific resistance to these effects. Even though there's a lot of empirical data and a lot of people report these experiences, it's still not in the academic mainstream. So I thought, well, there's something wrong here. Well, there's something wrong that I decided to write about was our worldview, this materialistic worldview, which is incompatible with psychic effects. And so what other worldviews are there? Or actually, are there any other worldviews? Well, it turns out, of course, there are many. And so what I decided to focus on in this book was Eastern esoteric worldview.
Yeah.
So that worldview is probably 20,000 years old, whereas the worldview of science is 500 years old. So scientific worldview has given us all kinds of technological advancements, and in medicine and everywhere else. So it gives us confidence that worldview has something going for it. and that's undeniable. But since it doesn't really account for consciousness very well, I thought, well, maybe a different worldview would give a different perspective on this. So as it turns out, the Eastern and Western esoteric worldviews have been around much longer, most of which has been pre-scientific and pre-technological, and gives a very different explanation for the nature of reality. So that's what the book about science and yoga is about. And primarily because when you look at the classical yoga in particular, it has, like Patanjali's famous Yoga Sutras, has an entire quarter of his book on the Yoga Sutras, which is devoted to the siddhis, which are the yogic powers that develop as a result of yogic practice. Well, the yogic siddhis are ancient Sanskrit terms for what today we would call psychic phenomena. And so we have modern scientific evidence that some psychic phenomena are real. We have a book that was written 2,000 years ago by a yogi in a very different culture, which is describing in different language, but describing the same kind of phenomena that we can see today. And so I said, okay, well, this suggests that there's something like their worldview, which is closer to the phenomena that we're seeing, which is not materialistic at all. But there's something about it that's real, because we can test it. So that gives us a clue that materialism alone, the materialism as it's seen today by mainstream science, is incomplete. The same could be said of idealism, which is the esoteric worldview. That's incomplete too. We need an integration of both to create some new kind of worldview that allows subjectivity to be just as important as objectivity.
Oh, I see.
So that's kind of what Supernormal is about.
Yeah, it is interesting. You mentioned that the yoga. That was actually my next question, but I didn't realize those were in Sanskrit. That's my wife prays in that language. So,
well, yeah. I mean, the Yoga Sutras were written in Sanskrit because that's all they had then.
Yeah. Well, yeah, she's Thai, and then her father was a monk. So I guess they read and speak Sanskrit, which I said that can't be right. That's thousands and thousands of years old. But I guess it's not a dead language. It's still used.
Yep.
So, well, yeah. Now on YouTube, you discussed neuroscientists talking with the Dalai Lama about Buddha, and I thought that was interesting also because my wife's a Buddhist. But so I was wondering, what are some of the abilities that this kind of meditation, these kind of powers, psychic abilities, if you were, would provide? Do you think?
Well, if you take either stories about the Buddha or stories from the Yoga Sutras, the most elementary siddhi that would arise is precognition, although it's usually described as becoming aware of past, present, and future all at the same time. So that's somewhere between clairvoyance and precognition. It's seeing beyond the constraints of ordinary space-time. So that is one of the most elementary siddhis. It spontaneously happens in people who are doing meditation. We know that through surveys of both beginning and advanced meditators, that they will sometimes describe it as spontaneous telepathy, spontaneous knowing of things at a distance, sometimes crazy synchronicities that happen. So these are very common for people who do meditation. So it's consistent with what, well, not so much with Buddha, because Buddha probably had special talents. So on the far end, like the close end, meaning you don't need much talent, you get clairvoyance, telepathy, and that sort of thing. At the far end, now you're talking about powers like levitation, bilocation, invisibility, that sort of thing. Those at this point, we cannot verify in the laboratory. There are still stories that people are able to do that, but at this point, they remain stories. If somebody can do that, they're either not willing to come into the laboratory to have it tested, or they come from a tradition, which is mostly Eastern traditions, where you're not supposed to pay much attention to those kinds of effects because they distract you from your goal, which is to become enlightened.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and so meditation and mindfulness and the search for enlightenment is becoming more and more popular in Western culture. I mean, I think especially mindfulness, right? It's just exploded in the last few years. Now, are there lessons that practitioners of this could take from your research to make their meditation more effective?
It depends on what your goal is. Meditation is taught in the West. All kinds of meditation methods. Mindfulness is basically Vipassana, but there are lots of other techniques. It is 90% or 99% focused on stress reduction, on mental and physical health, basically. And while that is part of classical yoga, it really wasn't that. The real goal was to be enlightened, to recognize who you actually are as opposed to what you think you are or what people tell you that you are. So if you wanted to develop psychic abilities, some people ask me, oh, how can I become psychic? Well, the time-honored approach is simply to meditate using any method at all. It could be sitting meditation, it could be walking meditation, it could be all kinds of things. And it has to do with quieting the mind and focusing. That's basically it. And then when you begin to do that, you transcend the everyday world and start to reach deeper levels of mind, which is where these kinds of phenomena become much more available.
Yeah. Well, now, so you have. So I'm sorry. I want to transition to your last book, also, Real Magic, and so that from what I've read, that's similar to yoga, except that it's more of a Western approach. Does that sound correct, or am I off base?
No, it's similar in the sense that Western esotericism comes out of the same origin as Eastern esotericism. If you go back far enough, there was no East and West. It's all one place. So at some point there was a split, and you have Western approaches like the Kabbalah and Gnosticism and Hermeticism and so on. But the ideas in these are different flavors that were shaped by language and culture, but they all devolved back into the same general idea, which is, as I was saying before, it's about a worldview where consciousness is fundamental, as opposed to the scientific worldview where matter and energy are fundamental. So they're like two ends of a spectrum, both the yogic cities, the Catholic charisms, virtually every religion accepts the reality of consciousness as being fundamental. In the Judeo-Christian approach, these kinds of special abilities are prohibited, usually because it would threaten the prevailing power of the church. Eastern religions recognize that these phenomena are real, and they didn't necessarily prohibit them other than saying, well, just don't get distracted by it, because that's not where you really want to end up. So the reason I wrote Real Magic is because after writing Supernormal, which is about Eastern esotericism, naturally people ask, well, what about Western esotericism? The difference then is in the Western esoteric traditions, the only reason why it's called esoteric is because it was pushed underground by the church. The church, meaning lots of churches, both the Catholic Church and the Jewish religion and Islam and all the others similar to that, all saw that people who had special abilities like this would deflect attention from the authority of the church. And so it became, if you look at the Catholic Catechism, any kind of magical practice, even if used for beneficial reasons like healing, were strictly off limits. It was like a really bad thing to do. It was a sin to use magic, which is why to this day, many people believe that stories like Harry Potter are blasphemous. They're dangerous, and that's why the books are banned. And it all comes out of this ancient tradition of deflecting people's attention, or with preventing people's attention on what actually happens if you start to encounter these kinds of phenomena. Like, it's okay for priests who have been given the ability to do these things, like the ceremony of the Eucharist is explicitly a magical practice. in Catholicism. It's not simply a symbolic practice. It is considered that wine and bread turn into other substances, body and blood. And that's not taken as a story. It's taken as this is literally true. So the idea that this magic occurs is part of the faith. In the Western approach, there were people who are saying, I don't know, why should I listen to the church if I can do something that's real myself? Well, obviously, this had to be pushed underground. So esoteric just means hidden, as does the word occult. It means it's been pushed away, so it's not in the light of day. And it never went away. Every esoteric practice, every mystical practice has magical things that they do. And they do it to today. There are many contemporary magicians who are following the same practices that people have done for thousands of years. And they fall into three categories, and the point of writing Real Magic was to say that the traditional magical methods are exactly what is studied in parapsychology. And so we know that some of the magical practices that people have done and still do, they're real. So hence, Real Magic.
Well, that was all the questions that I had, but I'd like to close by asking, what comes next for you? What are your pursuits in the future?
So because typically when I write another book, because I get feedback from the previous one and people start asking the same question again and again. So after writing Real Magic, the next question I get again and again is, how do I develop this? How do I use this? They want a book on practical magic. So I'm working on a book on practical magic. But I didn't want to do what hundreds of others have already done. You can go in a bookstore and look up things like practical magic, and there are dozens and dozens of books on spells and books on affirmations and books on this and that. And I could do a taxonomy of methods and a synthesis of this is what seems to work. But I thought, well, that's already been done, so I don't want to do that. I'm only interested in doing something that hasn't been done. So what hasn't been done, as far as I can tell, is to ask the hundreds or perhaps thousands of people around the world who are using magic as a practice, to ask them, what do you do and how do you know that it works? And then to actually have them do tests, to do experiments, to see objectively whether or not their beliefs about their magical practice is actually working. So part of the idea here is to create an evidence-based magic. It's to test people's ideas about magic, and these are people who do it all the time. They believe that it's real, and find out, well, what works and what doesn't work, with the idea of writing a book on practical magic based on the evidence of hundreds and hundreds of practicing magicians around the world today.
Yeah, it's intriguing. It is intriguing. So you're applying statistics to something really that hasn't been applied to before.
Not just statistics, because we're not only interested in what people believe, but what actually happens when they do experiments. So then we have objective evidence. Of course, it'll still be evaluated statistically, but we'll have actual experimental evidence that we can then compare to this practice or that practice and so on.
Well, Dean, thank you again for your time. I sincerely appreciate it. And so what I will do is transcribe this and write it up, and then I'll send you a copy before I publish. And usually there's a lot of editing involved, especially in this case, because I feel like I got a lot of my research wrong. But
no, I think it's useful to have interviews like this, because there's stories happen, and then unless someone takes the time to dive into the original literature, the story takes on a life of its own. And so I'm always grateful to have the opportunity to correct the story. Because I mean, if your only knowledge about this area was Wikipedia, for example, what you'd be learning is like a parallel world. It's so distorted from the way that things actually have occurred, and so one-sided in many cases, that it's not surprising at all that somebody who got interested in this would start reading Wikipedia, and they would come away thinking there's absolutely nothing to it. And that's just wrong. So,
yeah, and I didn't even want to dignify the critics. I'd seen criticism stuff online. I just didn't even want to dignify that. I don't know. I guess there's kind of like a psychological one-upmanship to it or something like that. There's a lot of psychology behind skepticism that goes unacknowledged.
Yes. And a lot of it is what I see in the most determined skeptics, the ones with a capital S who wear a shirt that says I'm a skeptic on it, and have buttons that have the word skeptic, and they put it everywhere. What they don't probably appreciate is that it's being the same kind of fundamentalist as a religious fundamentalist. It's buying into a belief structure where some of it is demonstrably really good. I'm not bashing science at all. After all, I'm a scientist. But it is uncritically accepting things that you could study for yourself. And so it's scientism. Just as religion is a set of beliefs based on faith of what others tell you, there is a kind of scientism that goes on where science becomes a belief system that you cannot question. And that, of course, is antithetical to science itself. And it happens. It's a pity, but you have to continually remind people that we're working with a set of provisional ideas. And unless you want science to stop in its tracks and never learn anything new, you cannot allow that to happen.
No, it's interesting. And I it's kind of an aside, but one of the other things I'd noticed also is whenever, and I guess social sciences and things like this would apply as well. But even in hard science, whenever you run an experiment, there's always data that falls outside of the experiment. Mm-hmm. And usually they just throw it away because it wasn't directly relevant, right? Or they didn't understand how it was directly relevant. But, but it's for a lot of scientists, it sticks in their head too. And then they say, well, I remember when we did this experiment, we had X, Y, and Z happen and we didn't know what to do with it, but it's still out there, right? It becomes part of their engineering mythology, scientific mythology that they hand down.
Right. But only a minority will actually follow up.
Yeah.
Because there's an enormous amount of pressure, status quo pressure that says, don't rock the boat. If you're really, really lucky, you can follow an anomaly for a career. And then if you're even more lucky, you discover that it really is something new and important. And if you're even luckier, you'll get awarded for that during your lifetime. But in many, many cases, you find that Nobel Prize winning things take sometimes 2 to 3 generations for people to recognize, oh, they were right all along. And for the people who make the original discoveries, more often than not, are following an anomaly. This thing just does not fit. But it's rare for people to actually risk. It's risky to do that. Risky for your career and risky for your reputation. So most people just don't do it.